Socially Democratic is hiring. Dunn Street is looking for a new podcast producer and social media manager to join our team in 2025. This versatile role is ideal for an early to mid-career social media strategist who wants to expand their skill sets, network with interesting people in the progressive organising space, and create engaging online content. The position is hybrid, primarily remote, with numerous opportunities for travel both interstate and internationally. And for more information on the role, or if you wish to submit an application, then send us through a cover note and your CV to rebecca@dunnstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also available on Patreon. Join our socially democratic community on Patreon for free or for as little as $2.50 a month, and you can help support the show. And we'd like to thank our latest member of our community, Jake, for joining our socially democratic team. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. They believe the law should serve everyone and not just those who can afford it. Maurice Blackburn has been fighting for workers' rights in Australia for more than 100 years, and they've helped more than 500,000 people get the compensation they deserve. And if you've been injured at work or on the road, you may have a claim through your superannuation. So for expert and empathetic legal support, please call Maurice Blackburn Lawyers today. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that drops every Friday, that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. It is a long overdue episode of the Feeney Files. We missed our October episodes. David Feeney, our former campaign director and member for Batman, is on the show today. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of different campaigns that have happened in the last 2 months, the whole thing. Lots of things to talk about with David. If you like the show, please don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Give us 5 stars and leave us a review on Apple Podcast, and obviously support the show by joining us on Patreon. And for everything else, make sure you follow Socially Democratic on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. All right, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Tuesday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. It has been some time since we've done this, our monthly episode. We missed October, so we've got a lot to catch up on. And I miss him dearly, and I know you do too. So this is going to be fun for our next installment of the Feeney Files. David Feeney, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Hello, nice to have you back in Australia, Stephen.
Great to be back. A lot has happened in the 2 months that we've been away. We've had a US presidential election. We've had a Queensland election. There's been a lot going on in federal politics. And there's a little bit going on in Victorian state politics. And there's also been local government elections as well. So we've got a lot to get through.
Let's do it.
In our hour, starting with obviously the US presidential election that happened. You and I did a number of segments in the months leading up to this one. I was certainly a lot more optimistic about it than I think you were. And I'm wondering if you're, I obviously know you wanted the good guys to win, but are you sort of feeling a bit like, told you so?
Well, it's not like me to gloat when I'm absolutely right, in contrast to all those around me, because that's something that I'm accustomed to. But if you cast back to, when we last talked about it, which was in the immediate aftermath of the Democratic National Congress or convention in Chicago, I think we did agree that there was a feeling that the Democrat machine had done an outstanding job moving Biden off stage, bringing Kamala centre stage. The vice president had established herself as a change candidate and a legitimate Democratic candidate, and had brought the Democrats, back into the race, and it was 50-50, and she had an energised base. That was kind of how our last episode finished. So I think it's worth thinking, well, gee, what happened after that? And I think as we watch the election unfold, all of my fears came to pass. So the Vice President held off doing substantive interviews for as long as she reasonably could. But eventually she started to have to do interviews and long-form interviews again, and her reticence to do that just heightened interest in her doing that. And I'm afraid to say that her performances sort of ranged between terrible and awful, didn't they? It was word salad city, to quote Axelrod. She spoke in circles. The future unburdened by the past. It was and that was a problem, that she couldn't wrestle serious political discourse or conversations with even friendly interviewers. So that became then a rolling problem. They seemed to lose sight of their status as the change candidate and how desirable that status was. And that was exemplified for me by the fact that the Vice President held her final pitch at the eclipse in front of the White House, with the White House behind her, which really is the kind of thing emphasising your incumbency. She would have been much better off doing that somewhere else, instead of underlining the point that she was an incumbent vice president. And that's, for me, emblematic of the fact that the Democratic campaign just lost sight of the fact that being the change candidate was the high ground, and having clawed her onto it, they did not want to give it up. And then we saw a failure to respond, I guess, effectively, or indeed at all, to a series of attacks that were made by the Republicans on her, and wrapping her up in immigration and transgender issues, and painting her as an extreme Liberal candidate. And you'll remember we talked quite some time ago, and I was concerned about the failure to have a primary and the fact that she was installed. My concern about that abated after Chicago, but it came roaring back when the Republicans talked about it incessantly and the Democrats didn't. And so it became known, as the coup, the Biden coup in right-wing circles in the United States. They really did emphasise the fact that she and a small cabal had taken over the presidency, thrown Biden over the cliff, and so all of those things started to go bad. And meanwhile, on the Republican side, what did we see? We saw Trump and Vance going to the opening of an envelope. They'd both go to anything. They both traversed new media, and there's been a lot of talk about how podcasts help them reach a lot of people, and I think that's a useful thing, perhaps, to reflect on another occasion. But there was I saw some commentary after the election from Democratic figures about how that kind of podcast ecosystem has become one that's hostile to Democrats, and of course that just infuriates me, because, of course, the reason it's hostile to Democrats is because, in large part, Democratic figures have refused to engage with it, and have fallen into the arms of legacy media, which, of course, is explicable because they're pretty friendly arms, but, refusing to go on Rogan. I don't just mean the Vice President not going on Rogan, but any Democrat who's invited to go on, Jordan Peterson or Rogan or any of these major podcasts, even those that have a right of centre flavour, Democrats have essentially boycotted them. So that ecosystem has grown up without them, and now it's influential and they're not a part of it. So, and Trump just ground her down, didn't he, around those issues I've already mentioned. And so we saw on the economy and on immigration and on the culture wars, her painted as a crazy left-wing incumbent, and he was the change candidate with a good economic record. And so the American people ended up concluding that Donald Trump was the less crazy of the two candidates and teams on offer. And that takes some doing. So it was a war of attrition in the last half of the campaign. And, the Democrats, I just feel like the Democrats went from, a super ninja performance in terms of how they managed the Congress and her installation and the energy around that convention, super ninja performance. And then what did they do? Did they send all their smart people on holidays? Like, what happened then? They had a budget twice as big as Trump's. They spent something like $1.8 billion and they got their asses handed to them.
I mean, there's a lot to unpack there that I kind of want to go deeper on. The first being the momentum that you're right. We did talk about that in a previous episode, the momentum that she had from the moment that Biden said that he wasn't going to recontest the presidency to her swift, warp speed, like it was over 24 to 48 hours in which she was essentially became the presumptive nominee all the way through to the convention. And if you track the major polls over that period, she made up the ground that Biden had lost over the better part of a year and a half. So she was like 9 or 10 points behind. And so you see this graph slowly climbing to catch up with Trump. And then it catches Trump and then it stalls. And so there are two schools I thought I have in my mind was she just getting back the base that had sort of wandered off and was like, Biden's too old, he can't run, and that was never going to move any higher than that? Or did she actually lose momentum? Was there something that they were doing in the campaign that meant that they lost that momentum? And the question that often gets asked of me since the election was, well, maybe this result was already baked in. Maybe those undecideds had already decided who they were going to vote for, and they were voting for Trump because Trump was the only one talking about the economy.
Well, I know everybody hates me doing this, but it wasn't just the economy. It was immigration and attendant issues of law and order, and it was culture wars. And these issues paralyse the left because we don't know how to talk about them. We don't know how to deal with the fact that people in large numbers disagree with us, but they do. And, I think a very interesting fact, Trump's strongest demographic in terms of age was 40 to 64. And the question is why? Why is that the strongest demographic? People are puzzling over this question. One possible answer is because they're parents. And parents have got a whole range of issues going on in terms of concerns about, their kids and the education systems, COVID lockdowns, campus riots, ideologically compromised classrooms, gender ideology, all of this stuff, parents are recoiling from, in enough numbers and in enough places. And, what's happening structurally is that while the left is talking identity politics, the right is talking class politics, and class is winning because the economy's hard, and poor whites and poor blacks and poor Latinos have more in common with one another than they do with the wealthier and more privileged and more powerful members of their own identity groups. And, that's as old as Marx. That should not be news, but it is. And so we've got this sort of strange, crazy universe where what were they thinking surrounding themselves with celebrities, for instance? That whole celebrity endorsement thing.
But they've always done that, though. That's all. That's just about turnout.
Yeah, but okay. I'd rather have the World Wrestling Federation figures on my side for turnout than Beyonce.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think the Democrats are, or at least enough of them, need to go back to first principles and have a long, hard look at themselves and how they, someone was talking about, Democrats are sending campaigners into parts of working class America as though they're missionaries to the Congo in the 18th century. And their message is that, I will help you be more like me.
Mm.
This is a significant problem. And, you and I talked about the fact that at the Republican convention, we saw this flipping with Teamsters and J.D. Vance talking about the forgotten Americans of the Appalachians and the working class. The kinds of speeches and figures that were just unimaginable a couple of decades ago in the Republican Party are now running it. Half of the most powerful figures in the current Democratic administration were Democrats themselves 5, 6, 10 years ago, including Elon Musk and Tulsi Gabbard, and God help us, Trump himself. So the great flip is on, and at the end of the great flip, the billionaires and working class are going to be on one side of the ledger, in part united by a common cultural language, and there's going to be these crazy people on the other side who are concerned about being misgendered in their pronouns and asserting how non-monogamous relationships are a way of decolonising settler sexuality. I know I do worry about that stuff because we're watching it eat the Democrats. I think in Australia we're watching it eat the Greens, and progressives need to be vigilant that this faculty lounge discourse doesn't just make them wildly veer into irrelevancy.
Look, I agree with what you're talking about there exists within the Democratic Party and the broad left in the United States. In my day job as a community organiser, I spent a lot of time in that space. And so I am amongst this sort of, I guess, this Ivy League leftist elite. And so that is the things that they're talking about. So I acknowledge that exists. I don't think that's defining the Democratic Party at this point in time. I think it possibly could in the future. And I don't think it was the reason why folks voted for Trump at this election. I do think that the overarching issue was either the economy or immigration. And the ads that I was seeing in Michigan were geared towards those two issues. They did that transgender one, she's for they, them, and he's for us. But I think that was more about a us versus them, it was a play on words about the pronouns uses. But I think most Americans don't know about that kind of stuff. And I do think that it was the ad was more effective because it was talking about an us versus them frame, not,
yes.
do you know what I mean?
But it was going back to her 2019 presidential campaign, when she veered to the left as a decision of strategy and said a lot of dumb stuff that she then never walked back, and hanging her with her own words and making her appear to be the sort of fruitcake lefty from San Francisco that you insisted she wasn't when I said she was.
Yeah.
And whether she is or isn't is almost irrelevant now because they put $250 million into an ad saying she was, and she never responded to it.
Yep. Agreed.
And what a great ad. I mean, you get to talk about transgender criminals and illegal refugees all at the same time. It's like the right-wing trifecta. And they were smashing her with it.
Yeah, true.
She's for thee, them, and Donald Trump is for you.
One other thing that I would also just push back on again is that and I've always held the view, and I've always been told by Democratic campaigners and even Republicans as well, is that US presidential electoral campaigns are strategically just based on turnout. Register as many voters as you possibly can and then turn them out at the polls. And that it is not what it's like in Australia, which is we are not a turnout election because of compulsory voting, and that we focus on persuasion, the persuadability of a voter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, and so when you're on the ground in the United States on a campaign, you're knocking on the doors of registered Democrats and you're just trying to encourage them to vote.
Yeah.
However, if you look at...
But that's a broken strategy, right?
Well, no, that's what I'm going to get to, because I do actually think there is volatility in the American electorate, because I think there is a core group of voters, and I think this will bear out more at around about March when the people have had more time to analyse this particular election. But there is a trend happening in which there's a group of voters that voted Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump. And there's probably only a couple of million of them across those battleground states. But these races are so damn close since 2016 that a couple of million are actually deciding who's going to become president. And so what happened was in that Obama era of 08 and 12, the Obama coalition was so big, like it was so big that Obama was winning handsomely, like way more than what Trump has just won recently, okay? He won North Carolina. He won Indiana in 08 and only lost those two states the second time around. This was a massive coalition, but he was winning across all those demographics, all those cohorts substantially, and that's not happening now. And the Democrats are rubbing their hands together and saying, if we'd done this, this, and this,
but let's talk about that for a second.
Then we would have won. But the problem is that they can't afford to just win. They need to win substantially. And so too the Republicans as well. The Republicans only just won this election, really. And what has to happen, I think that the problem for the Democrats was they had swings against them in all, and I said this in a couple of shows with the American guys, in all, it's not just working class, it was middle class as well. Middle class America swung against the Democrats at this race.
Everybody did, mate.
Everyone did. That's what I'm saying.
Every
Everyone
single
did.
demographic group did.
But I'm just pushing back on you saying...
The biggest swings were 45 to 64. Let me just... I feel like that the Democrat business model is busted. The business model they've relied on is that, the Republicans are going to win an overwhelming majority of the counties, but we're going to win the most populous ones. And our blue dots on the map are going to vastly outnumber the red swathes of countryside around them. And in that way, we will assemble giant majorities in our cities. Like one famous county, which in Philadelphia was 30,000 to 1 for Obama. That's a true story. But that business model is broken because the extent to which those Republican counties, rural counties are voting Republican, is growing. The number of them voting is growing. And at the same time, the sort of giant majorities that the Democrats used to produce from those urban heartlands is decaying. Obama was getting 9 out of 10 black men. Now, 1 in 5 is voting Republican. The Latinos, so you look confused at that. Yeah,
No. Yeah.
Latinos are now voting 45% for the Republicans. So the model that was said, enormous majorities bolstered by overwhelming support from minorities in our urban heartland will help us overrun the rest of the country isn't working. And, Trump won a popular vote, which is the first time the Republicans done that since, I think, 2002, 312 electorate votes, the Senate and the House. It's a significant victory. It's silly to say anything else.
It's significant, but the margins are still quite tight, is what I'm trying to say. It's not, this victory for Trump isn't Obama 08 or Obama 12. Yes, they've won back all the things they needed to win, but they won them all quite closely. It's still quite a close electorate. And I think we're both in agreement here about the Obama coalition has been fragmented by the Republicans because more Latinos are moving across to the Republican Party. There's a breaking of African-American men to the Republican Party, not in huge numbers, but enough, right, to make up, to jag this win. And obviously in those rural counties, Obama used to win a lot of those rural counties. And if he didn't, he was only just losing them. And the Democrats aren't even in the race now in these rural counties. They're trying to run up to your point.
And more of them are voting.
Yeah, they're trying to run up the score in the cities and to mitigate against the losses in the rural counties. Yep. The other thing I'll say is that Donald, and this one of my, if I was, like the good old Labor Party, post-election campaign review, one thing I'd put into the Democratic campaign review is after the midterms, start your presidential primary then. Because one thing we do benefit in the Westminster system is that we have an opposition leader that runs for 3 or 4 years against the opponent. Donald Trump basically was the opposition leader for 4 years.
For sure.
And Kamala Harris was the leader for about 20 minutes. And so after the
7 days,
for the after the 2026 midterms, the Democrats should move straight into primary season and select their candidate and give them 2 years to run against Trump, or not against Trump, but against whoever the nominee will be for the Republican Party. Would be one of the things I do. Anyway.
And, what everybody has said, I think, is true, and that is that the vice president did not have enough time. 107 days wasn't enough. And that ultimately is Biden's sin for even nominating for a second term, as well as the sin of shared by all of those who hid his decay from the American people and everybody else. And I think a primary system, which, may have made a difference at the margins around her authority and legitimacy as a candidate, but certainly might have done something to bolster the Democrat presidential candidate's capacity to engage in, the rough and tumble of interviews and, podcasts and debates and all the rest of it, where I just felt she was protected by bubble wrap for too long, and it became a glaring negative.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, well, hey, there's going to be plenty of material for the next 4 years as a consequence of that little happening.
Oh, news media outlets are wrapped. Stand-up comedians are wrapped. SNL's become legitimate again because of Trump being in the White House. So, yeah, there's some upsides to it, I guess.
I mean, MSNBC might be about to fall to its knees and Elon Musk might be about to buy it, but, whatever.
Yeah. I was about to say swings and roundabouts. I don't know if that applies in this context. Let's go to Queensland because that happened whilst you were away, while we weren't doing a show. The Queensland election happened at some stage in October, late October. We just want to get your reflections on that. Obviously, we did 4 episodes with Evan and Jackie, Evan Moorhead and Jackie Trad, which I really appreciated their input. I think my biggest takeaway from it was that even though Labor lost, everyone thought Labor was going to get their ass handed to them, like really ass handed to them, in such a volatile state like Queensland. And sure enough, they did lose, but they didn't lose as badly as people predicted. And I think a lot of that goes down to Stephen Miles and the campaign team for literally throwing everything, including the kitchen sink, at this campaign. And I do wonder what would have happened if Miles had been given a little bit more of a runway to bed himself in as Premier of the state before the election. I wonder if Anastasia Palaszczuk probably hung on a little bit too long. Anyway, there were my reflections. What are your takeaways from Queensland?
As always, I'm a bit more critical than you. I had the impression that Miles was kind of, to be really cruel. He always looked like a boy sent to do a man's job. He just looked a little out of his depth, and he really proved me wrong, I think, during the campaign. He just showed such tenacity and resilience. And every time he was knocked down, he was up again. I was very impressed with how he just relentlessly fought the fight, and I think won the rugged respect of a lot of voters who were quite determined not to vote for him, and I think a lot of them eventually did. So I give him very, very high points indeed. I did chuckle about the fact that, early on in the campaign, the Katter Party, God bless their cotton socks, came up with this idea of, a charter around abortion and threw that dead cat onto the table. And then, Miles picked it up and said, "This is a terrible thing," and just ran with it. And the coalition stared at the dead cat, and half of them said, "Well, gee, I like the dead cat," and half of them said, "Stay away, it's a trap." And they just fell into total dysfunction as, some of them just could not help but resist telling us about their views on abortion, and boom, that was off. And then in the other corner, the sort of the Luddites who started this, the Katter Party, suddenly discovered that there were lots of people in their own electorates who actually were quite pro-choice. And they started to walk back their own pronouncements. So it was a comedy skit. The abortion issue in that election was a comedy skit, and it played out well for Labor. It a nonsense of an issue, but I think humiliated Crisafulli and it eviscerated any sense that he could dominate his own party when things were moving fast and interesting, and showed that Miles could, see an opportunity and take it. So I thought that was hilarious. I think. The Labor machine, I worry that it didn't see some of the things that were going on around it, that it seemed to be surprised by losing seats like Rockhampton. Some of these Labor strongholds vanished on them, and I'm not sure they saw that coming. So as ever, I worry about, the parliamentary team might have been performing well, but, how well was the machinery underneath them performing? I'm a bit sceptical. And finally, I would say it was actually a very heavy election defeat, but it was disguised by the fact that returns took so long to come in. And so if you were watching the coverage on election night, for many, many hours, it looked close, which meant that for the critical hours when commentators were trying to look intelligent, journalists were trying to look like they knew what was around the corner, everyone was saying, well, this is a close election. And it meant that all of the Labor spokespeople on those programs and doing that coverage were pleasantly surprised that they weren't carrying out all the dead bodies by 7:30 p.m, but were still going at 10:30 and 11. And it meant, of course, that the Liberals couldn't claim victory early in the night. Once all of the returns were counted, it was in fact a heavy defeat. But it's not going to go down in history as one because of that strange oddity of election night. I think Miles might have misstepped not conceding on election night, but, them's the breaks. So that's my wrap-up of Queensland. I don't think there's much good in it for federal Labor. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself by raising that issue with you.
It actually is funny, your recollections on election night, because if you're the election night TV producer and you want to keep eyeballs watching, it actually turned out quite well, right? No one wants to watch a blowout sporting game, and the same for an election night as well. So it actually did drag along quite well. I just think when I said it was, it was a heavy defeat, but it wasn't as bad as, being reduced to a caucus that can fit in a Tarago.
Yeah, they went back to 9 or whatever.
Yeah, which has befallen the party in the past. And they did reasonably well. I mean, they held the seat in the Gold Coast, which they were, they just didn't think that was the case. So there was a couple of small victories for the party that just wouldn't have normally been on the card. So anyway, we'll watch and see. Okay, you've mentioned federal government, so let's do this. Look, and I say I want to begin this part of the segment by just noting that those that are regular listeners to this podcast will know that this is an overtly pro-Labor podcast, and we are incredibly biased, and we take broadly an editorial view that we don't shit on the party too much, because there's enough of that happening in mainstream media anyway without, a left-wing podcast doing that. Having said that, though, I'm interested to get your thoughts, David, on the how the federal government are faring. We're coming towards the end of the year. I find that, and I reckon a lot of Labor Party members, both rank and file members, but also current and ex-staffers at coffee catch-ups, weekend dinners, numerous WhatsApp groups that you're probably in that are just chock full of, Labor friends and family and whatever.
Monday quarterbackers, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Are all saying, and this is my lived experience, so I'm only saying what I'm hearing, and they're all talking to one another about the prospects of an Albanese government And the view that I'm getting from everyone on Main Street within the party is that federal Labor is in dire straits. And in the time that we have between our last episode and this one, and I'm going to miss a whole bunch of things, but what worries me is that we're on in the media for all of the wrong reasons. In the time that we've been away, while the nation's in the middle of a housing crisis, Albanese goes and buys a second holiday home. And that is front page for a couple of days. While the nation's in this sort of cost of living crisis, all we hear about is Albanese on the phone to Qantas to get, free upgrades. We're banning kids from the internet. Claire O'Neill's doing media on leaving the NUW and joining the AWU faction like she's a starting quarterback who's just signed for the New England Patriots. Why we're doing media on joining a new faction. And there's probably a whole bunch of other things that I've even missed while I was overseas. Now, I'm not saying, to quote David Feeney, that I'm not saying that we are fucked in a tunnel, but we are about to enter said tunnel and find ourselves potentially fucked. That's kind of, I think, where we are right now. And I just want to get your thoughts on where do you think Labor's fortunes are at a federal level at this moment in time?
Yes. Well, of course, worrying about the Labor Party is our hobby. So why would we stop? It being in the luxurious position of giving people free advice, we're not going to stop doing that either. I do worry. So let's just think about some of the things we've learnt over the last little while from international elections, and what might be the drivers for coalition success here in Australia. We don't have an immigration issue at the moment that is sort of front and centre of our politics. Always has the potential, though. And the government has run into trouble courtesy of the High Court. And that does sort of bring immigration law and order issues together in a way that's been destructive for the government. And that still hums away. And in more recent times, we've seen the government's effort to reduce immigration and to wreck education as an immigration pathway, opposed, interestingly enough, by Dutton. So there is an immigration debate, but its scope and its scale is still being worked out. But we need to watch that with great interest, I think. Most critically, of course, we have the economic debate, where we haven't had interest rate relief. It's now suggested that interest rate relief is not likely until May. That's what our banks are now saying. And I was hoping that we might get an interest rate rise before Christmas and one sort of in the immediate aftermath of Christmas, which would have been a beautiful thing. There's now good reasons to think that's not happening.
You said interest rate rise. I think you meant interest rate drop.
Yes, I did. Sorry. Yes, you're quite right. That we might get some relief, and that relief isn't coming. So that's bad. And then we've, of course, got the added concern of suggestions that the federal budget's days in surplus might be over, and that, in fact, the next budget might be in the red, which, of course, leads one to suspect that there won't be another budget before the election. And then, we have the usual extraneous issues which populate politics, which includes, some woke issues, but we saw the government prosecuting its misinformation bill, which I personally think was an appalling piece of legislation. We dodged a bullet by having the government pull that. We've had electoral reform now going into the parliament. So, this is a very long-winded way of me saying, as I've said previously more succinctly, there's no sense that Labor's on top of the issues agenda. There's no sense that Labor is setting the agenda or framing the political debate. Things happen to it, and it muddles along. Now, you talked there about a couple of issues. Albo's house. I'm a bit sensitive about politicians being attacked for buying a house, Stephen.
What? Do tell, David. Why would that be the case?
My therapist said I bought a house in Northcote for $2.3 million, and that house lived on the front page of the Australian for quite some time. So I might find myself more than unusually sympathetic to Albo here. But, those issues, together with the issues like the upgrades, that's the malice of News Limited. And I've ranted about this before. There is The Murdoch party has the support of the Murdoch press, and the Murdoch press are going to hang around in the wings like a vampire, waiting for the moment whenever it can to come in and kick Labor or rip out our necks. And they've done that before. They'll do it again, and they'll keep doing it. And if the Labor Party isn't going to do anything about the Murdoch press, that's, so be it. But the Murdoch press aren't going to drop their guard. They understand their mission, which is to defeat Labor and destroy Labor governments, and they will be on that case every day of the week. And so you've cited a couple of examples where they succeeded in doing us some harm, and Labor just has to factor that in because that's what they will always do. So all of this amounts to what we see in Newspoll, which is Dutton and the Prime Minister becoming more equal adversaries as preferred Prime Ministers, and in terms of their POS-neg, their positive-negative ratings. And the primary vote of the Labor Party apparently stuck at about 32, while the Liberals are now, or the coalition, I should say, are sort of floating up towards 40. And that, of course, makes for an election which, depending on the week, is 49-51 or 51-49. And for us to be in that position at the end of our first term is awful. Now, when I offer, as I generously do, this advice to my brothers and sisters in Canberra, after they've finished rolling their eyes and wishing that I'd just go away, they say things that don't alleviate my concern. Things like there are lots of historical examples, John Howard and Bob Hawke, of first-term governments running into strife but going on to be long and successful governments. And so this kind of first-term blues is perhaps symptomatic of Australian politics and has been symptomatic of other long-term and successful governments. Another point is that the coalition will start this contest with only 55 seats in the House of Representatives. They have to find 20. When you look at the map, it's very hard to find 20 for the coalition. So they might have a good election and they might win lots of seats, but they're very unlikely to be put into a majority. And that means Labor's worst case scenario is probably having to govern as a minority government with the support of the Teals. And that worst case scenario doesn't seem to trouble them very much. So, and I fear breeds complacency. If the worst thing that's going to happen to a minister is after the election they're going to still be a minister and they're going to have to spend more time talking to Teals, they're okay with that. So, of course, the worst case scenario is that they don't just have to govern with the Teals, they have to govern with the Greens, and that their world of pain is much worse. But in any event, those are just anecdotal reflections. Of course, that's none of that has any formal standing, but that's my sort of anecdotal reflections on the government. And I guess I fear it is complacent about its prospects. I don't feel reassured by the examples of first-term John Howard and first-term Bob Hawke, because every race is different, and this race is different. I feel like, there's this strange, I think Albo, as I've said before, I feel like the Prime Minister has assembled a cabinet of unusual talent. I reckon there's lots of talent on that Labor front bench. And I think he has engendered a culture in the cabinet where they are all free to run their own races and, be innovative and creative in their portfolios. And I think he's done that too. And those are significant things to have achieved. What he needs to do and hasn't done, in my humble opinion, is still control the joint ruthlessly at the centre in terms of its message and in terms of its strategic thinking. And that's where I feel the show is being let down and is not, and that's why it's not ruling the roost. And you just can't underestimate. And after 2 weeks in Canberra, I'm just reminded how thick that bubble is. And, we've just got a lot of decision makers sitting, surrounded by bureaucrats and stakeholders and one another. And you just worry about how much of the real world breaks in there and makes itself felt. And so too many people are busy and productive and doing good things that nobody notices and don't win us a vote. And conversely, the coalition, which has, struggles to find brain cells to rub together after the first 2 or 3 shadow ministers. I mean, they're in the middle of an unusually, bad period in terms of the brain drain that's depleted their ranks over the last 2 election cycles. So frantic for talent. Dutton's got 2 or 3 decent people, and after that it's just, they can barely read or write. It's as desperate as it's ever been. So he's not going to let his front bench be seen because he can't afford to. So it's going to be Dutton, the Dutton show. It's just going to be Dutton, wall-to-wall Dutton at the next election, which will give them a unity of message and a sense of authority in the federal campaign that we saw Morrison achieve when he had to hide all of his front bench. I worry too, Stephen, and I feel a little bit better for having told you about it. But, I worry too.
There are 2 areas that I want to pick up on what you just said there, David. Messaging and strategic thinking. Because I think you are right. I think that there are a whole bunch of caucus members and members of the cabinet that are doing good work in policy areas. But the strategy of a government or an opposition is to, and Daniel Andrews, I don't know if he's ever said this on the show or he's just said this to me privately, but he thinks about election cycles like a game of golf or trying to get to the green. Like, what is the shot? Where do you want to be on the fairway before you make that shot onto the green? And that's kind of like the last year before the election. Where do you want to be? And therefore, you've got to work out, well, what's the shot before that to get to that shot and so on and so forth, right? And so trying to break down the 3 or 4 year cycle strategically and then understanding where does your government or where does your opposition need to be before you head into that election year is the first thing. And that requires strategy. And I just don't know if I've ever understood what the government strategy was in respect to that, which then leads me to the second point that you just said, which was messaging. What is the grid of issues or ideas that Labor wants to focus its energy on? Now, I want to go back to a couple of campaigns in the past to demonstrate, political communication 101. Tony Abbott and the grid of 2013 election that he took. If you can remember, these were the 4 things that he only ever spoke about ad nauseum. I should do a test for you, Dave, and see if you can remember what the 4 things were.
I don't think I will, but I know cuts to the ABC or SBS was on there.
Sorry, go.
You're actually going to put me through this torture, are you? Well, obviously there was climate change. So that was his number 1, I think. Protect Medicare, balance the budget, no cuts to ABC, SBS, or other cultural institutions that Tony wanted to kill but not be revealed as the murderer of.
You did well. You did quite well. You did quite close. Here are the 4 things that he said ad nauseum. We'll build a stronger economy so everyone can get ahead. We'll scrap the carbon tax so your family will be $550 better off a year. We'll get the budget back under control by ending Labor's waste, and we'll stop the boats. That's all he ever said.
How could I forget about the boats?
I know. That's all he ever said, okay? Just constantly. Like, I think he got asked someone one day about, you're taking your daughter for a swim, and then he said, I'll take her a swim, and after that I'll get back into ensuring that we stop the boats. Like he just knew how to constantly be on message. I'll go to the other side of politics. Daniel Andrews, 2014, their grid was save TAFE because job starts with skills. Get Victoria back to work with creating 10,000 new jobs. end the war on paramedics and save the minutes that saves lives, remove 50 most dangerous and congested level crossings. That's all he ever talked about, right? Now, people saying, well, Stephen, that's an opposition. That's their job. Well, guess what? They also had a grid in 2018 from government as well. They were going to give free TAFE. They were going to do more funding into mental health after the Royal Commission. They were going to bring in the suburban rail loop, and they're going to end wage theft. They were always on the grid of jobs, health, education, and public transport. They were the 4 areas that the research had said they were winners for Labor, and that's all we're going to talk about, right? So Dutton right now, guess what all he's talking about? Labor's energy policy is a shambles. Labor's cost of living crisis is out of control. Labor's continuing immigration visa shambles, and the coalition's plan to revive the home ownership dream and boost building across Australia. Now, I can just see them starting to settle in on what they want to talk about, right? It might not be perfect just yet, but you can get a sense that Dutton is coalescing around a grid that he wants to talk about. So what is Labor's?
Yes. Well, I guess we spoke, didn't we, some time ago about how Labor came out of the blocks at the start of this year with an apparent resolve to wrestle the agenda and take control by reconfiguring the tax cuts and announcing that, a significant achievement, and then going into a budget where the budget was back in black and it was a second surplus budget. So tick, 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 tick. But everything's fallen away since those early months in the year. I know I go on about this a little bit, but I do think that that the war in Gaza, perhaps too in very recent times, the US elections, has just completely fixated the attention of the whole political class in this country. It was interesting to me looking at US polling, and the US is different, and blah, blah, blah. But after the election, rating institutions from loved to hated, the most popular institution in the United States was the US military. The second most popular was its police, interestingly enough. The most hated institution was Hamas. And right down the bottom were campus protesters and the Palestinian Authority. Why do I mention that? Because I think Labor has found itself over the course of 2024 governing a country where the normal still waters of social cohesion have been bubbling and frothing. And it's been very discombobulating for the Labor government. It hasn't really known how to handle it. Proof of that is the fact that after 12 months of war in the Middle East, Labor has managed its approach to that conflict in such a way as to ensure that every Jewish Australian and Muslim Australian are joined in the fact that they hate the government. We have brought Arabs and Jews together, Stephen. They all fucking hate us. And what an achievement. Maybe we should send our team in Canberra into the UN where they can bring these peoples together. So I feel, and I just fear that too many Australian voters see these marches in their streets or on their television sets and they think, this is crackers and this is a foreign war being brought to our streets, and the people who are bringing it to our streets I don't like, which I think is part of the reason why the Greens vote has decayed a little bit. And I think that rebounds on the government. It's hurting Labor in two respects. One, it hurts us. The second is it apparently completely preoccupies us. And we have failed to change the channel. And so everyone's watching this disaster movie and they're not watching what Labor is doing in other fields of endeavour. And that hurts.
What annoys me the most is that we've failed to take the spoils and the resources of government and use 3 years to get shit done in the areas that are most important to voters and making their lives better, and then being able to communicate that to the electorate, and then setting themselves up in a position where they should be really in the polls 52, 53, 54 after doing such a great job in government, and then handing that to Paul Erickson and the campaign team at NatSec and saying, right, now run a campaign based on the things that we're going to do in the next term. Because that's basically what you should be doing. It's what every state Labor government has done consistently since the 90s. If they've always just got in by the skin of their teeth, chinny chin chin, and then go on to then win at a landslide next election, and not just because, hey, we're the government, because they've actually done stuff, right? And the question is, I would say, I was talking to someone the other day, someone said to me, Stephen, what's the Labor government done for us in the last 3 years? And I was at a bit of a loss to actually being able to pinpoint some of those
There's
things.
roads, there's plumbing. What have the Romans done for us?
Yeah, exactly. Public health, irrigation.
I mean, there are some accomplishments. I'm sure there are innumerable accomplishments I can't recall, but there are. Tony Burke, for instance, has done things around industrial relations, which matter. There are. I'm concerned that a lot of these ministers, talented, energetic, innovative, are off doing things that no one's hearing about.
Because there's no grid, though.
Yeah,
there's no grid.
Yes, that's right. And there's no central domination of the message in such a way as to clear the deck of other issues and just talk about whatever it is for a while. The
Andrews government had a 80-20 rule. 80% of the time we're talking about our grid. 20% of the time we're talking about those other things.
Yeah, but we've talked about this before, Stephen. You've got to stop talking about the junior leagues when we're talking about the senior leagues.
It's the same. It's the journos that are in the press gallery in Canberra are just as shit as the one in Melbourne. They're just as bad.
We're talking about adult sport now, Stephen, not the under 12s.
Okay. Anyway, they're running out of time because in 2 weeks' time, the entire voting population goes to the beach for literally 6 weeks, and they come back on the 1st of February, and allegedly we're meant to be having an election in February, and it's going to be too late for us to come out and say, hey, look at us, look at all the amazing things we do, and give us another term. I'm just worried. I'm just putting it out there. There you go.
I worry too.
Okay, we need to talk about more positive things. So let's talk about Victorian state politics and the insanity that is the Greens. Sam Hibbins, who's was anyway, the member for Prahran, the Greens member for Prahran is, we're heading for a by-election in the state seat of Prahran. Sam Hibbins initially resigned from the Greens leadership after it became public that he had an affair with a staff member. Then he quit the Greens entirely, and now he's quitting Parliament altogether. So these are big jumps. So something tells me there's more to it than just having an affair with someone in his office. Then we find out that someone broke into Sam Hibbins' parliamentary office at some point over the last couple of days, conducted a smoking ceremony to rid the office of evil spirits, and defecated and vandalised photos of him and his family. And this is the freak show that wants to be the major left-wing party in Australian politics and govern. David, what do you make about this?
Well, I did think it was rather entertaining. I mean, what I saw was, firstly, Sam Hibbins come out and say, I've had an extramarital affair. This has been very destructive for my family. It means I have to resign as, co-convener and shaman of the Greens party. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Happens from time to time. There you go. Then I expected the Greens would come out and say something like, oh, he's given the Greens a lot of service, and thank you very much for your service. And now he's to err is human, and blah, 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 and good luck and goodbye. Something like we've seen that movie before, haven't we? So that's what I expect. Instead, what we saw was the chief commissar and inquisitor from the morals police unit of the Greens come out and say, this is a disgrace. What he's not suffered enough. That we don't tolerate this kind of behaviour. We're going to kill him. We're going to kill his family. We don't care what it is, his mother, his father, his dog. If he loves it, it's dead. We are the Green Inquisition. I was just astonished at the vitriol, all this boiled up hatred. And, the Green member for Melbourne is an unusually hateful political figure, but she surprised me. I thought, wow, they're really getting into this guy. And then, of course, he says, well, I'm resigning from Parliament because, every branch member of the Greens has been given my home address and told to attack me. I thought it was pretty wild. So the fact that they've now broken into his office and conducted an exorcism there, I think is consistent with, how, there are police who patrol the streets of Tehran to make sure that people comply with the theocracy's rules. And you just get a feeling that the Greens are the same, don't you? And their moral police dragged this guy off the street and they're not done with punishing him yet. So he's resigned from the Parliament and, from the look of it, he got out lightly. So I didn't see this as being, a more to the story than meets the eye. I saw this as just being emblematic of the censorious moral superiority and sanctimony of the Greens, where instead of, waving somebody a fond farewell and ushering them off the stage as quickly as possible, because we're talking here about a man who, as far as I comprehend it, had a consensual relationship, a consensual extramarital relationship. So bad, but, not criminal. People's feelings were presumably hurt, but we're not talking about, anything ugly, as we've sadly seen in other places in the political universe. Not recommending it, but certainly bringing it into perspective. But it didn't matter. Like, as far as the Greens were concerned, his head needed to be cut off and put on a stake for everyone to see for quite some time. So I thought the Green reaction was just extraordinary. Do you like that analogy?
It was lovely. It was beautiful. Okay, I'll jump to the next question then. So clearly, I can only assume there's more to it than what's been written about in the media, because it's high stakes stuff for the Greens, who clearly want to hang on to seats, not lose them, create a situation upon which there is now a by-election. And I want to ask you a question, David, about the by-election, because in some ways, well, for those outside of the state of Victoria, the seat of Paran has, since 2014, 18 and 22, has been a three-way contest between Labor, the Liberal and the Greens, with the Greens winning on all three occasions, but only by a handful of votes, depending on what candidate was getting eliminated. So there's a lot of risk in this by-election for both the Greens because of their brand is clearly on the nose. We've seen that at a local government election just recently in Victoria, and obviously what happened up in Queensland in the inner city. So they would be worried about holding onto this seat. Labor's the incumbent government, and I know certainly I can't speak for what the attitude is within the government or within head office, but I know that when I worked at head office, we hated by-elections because one, they're expensive, and two, you just never want to run them, and they'll be umming and ahhing. And then obviously the Liberal Party, a lot of pressure on the leadership of John Pesutto. He needs to win this, otherwise his leadership will be called into question, as it is and seems to be every week that the Parliament sits. So a lot of pressure for all three parties. My question to you, David, is, does Labor run a campaign in the Paran by-election?
Yeah, I think Labor should. For some of the reasons you've already set out, which is that it's close. This is real estate that we have fought hard for previously. And I think it's a mistake to let that real estate go through a major political contest with you not being in it. If you imagine that you're going to be competitive there again eventually, you've got to stay in it to win it. And as I've previously said, I think, when the Green Party had, brought us to some very close results here in Wills and Batman in 2016, and then they stopped competing for a period of time, that has meant that Labor in these parts is now more resilient than it might otherwise have been. That'll be put to the test, of course, in a few months' time. But I guess my point is we want to stay strong and aggressive in Paran, generally speaking, anyway. But more to the point, very hard, I would have thought, for the Premier to explain why she would not be competing in an electorate which is on the face of it close. The stakes are also very high for Pursuta, as you say. He's had quite a bit of rancour in his party as a result of the litigation and the undermining of some of his colleagues. So he's got a fragile issue, and we want to make as much of that as we can. And the Greens, like, how are they going to go in Paran after their moral police have just dragged their philandering member off into the torture chambers for another beating? How are they going to respond to to how the Greens have behaved and what's happened to their MP? I think we can be reasonably confident that it's not going to be a smooth handover from the former member to a Green candidate. So, yeah, I reckon we should be in it. And I think we're going to do badly, let's find out, right?
Yeah, exactly. It took the words literally out of my mouth. I was about to say, one, Labor should always be in a contest that we can win. Like, don't ever just sort of say, oh, we've got 9 seats, that's enough. No, you should always continue. And I know by-elections are expensive in terms of comparing it to where that seat would fit within a broader campaign. Yeah, it's expensive, right? By-elections are now upwards of $1 million. So, but it's not just expensive for us, it's expensive for the Tories and for the Greens as well. So it's not just us spending money too. We should always be in a contest. And I think it's actually a really good test for just Premier Allen and her leadership for that team to go out there. We've got a new state secretary as well, to get out there and take the car for a spin and see how it goes. Because if we win, then that's fantastic. That's a new seat within our stocks, and that's more resources for the party. If we lose, it's actually a good wake-up call. I don't think we need to hide from the electorate. We've got to face up to the electorate and show our strength. But if we do lose, then it's a good wake-up call. And also, there are always lessons from that. I remember in 2017, and David, you'll know this because you were very much involved in this campaign, the Northcote by-election, state Northcote by-election. We lost that. But I can even speak personally from my experience as a party official. There was a lot of lessons from that election defeat that we learned from and that we adapted into the 2018 statewide general election. And I'm glad. And
there's another point too, your Northcote example, I think, is a good one of this too, which is if the electorate is in a situation where they want to give you a kick in the pants, let them give you a kick in the pants, because then you're closer to getting into the next part of your relationship, after you get through anger. And I think there's a little bit of that in Northcote. You'll remember that Lydia Thorpe, the delightful Lydia Thorpe, won Northcote for the Greens in that by-election, and made the mistake of meeting a lot of her constituents. And 18 months later, she lost the seat to Labor. And I think, at least in part, as we explain that Labor recovery in the seat of Northcote, it's because people who were angry with Labor for whatever reason had the opportunity to express it. And dodging that moment of reckoning doesn't make it any easier.
Agreed. Okay. Let's the last topic I want to talk about, and it's very rarely we do this, but let's cover all 4 levels of government. All 3 levels of government in.
You're counting the US as one of the levels of government.
I actually was. That's Freudian, isn't it?
Our masters in Washington.
That's so bad.
Yeah,
but I really do think that.
I think the moral police need to come and visit you now.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you won't be able to get in because of my big flag of freedom at the front door. Is local government elections in Victoria. Anyone else who's from outside the state will probably go, oh, Stephen, really, we're going here? But I just want to say, I mentioned last time.
At least as important as ACT elections, for instance, and you covered those.
We didn't cover that, but that was a great result for the party there. And I've talked about it on other shows. City of Melbourne elections were held on the 25th of October. As folks all know, I sort of made some opening remarks last time David was on the show about what was going on in that race, because I was the campaign director for one of the tickets, Nick Reese's campaign to win the mayoralty for the City of Melbourne. And we were successful. And I just want to say congratulations to Nick Reese and Rashina Campbell on their election to Lord Mayor and Deputy Lord Mayor. Nick becomes the first Labor member elected to the position of Lord Mayor in the City of Melbourne. So well done. While I'm doing that, just want to do a couple of drive-bys to some of the other candidates. Aaron Wood what a terrible campaign you ran. It was all tip and no iceberg. You ran a campaign that made you look like a dodgy nightclub promoter. It reeked of like a PR agency had got hold of your campaign and had never wandered into a political campaign before in your entire life. And people bought that. And that's why you came fifth, even though you thought that you were going to win the election. Don't bring a knife to a gunfight. And while I'm at it, to the Labor campaign, you had legitimate ambitions of the mayoralty. And if you did so, don't run a Bush League campaign performance. My unsuccessful run for school captain in 1993 had more depth than your campaign. It was pathetic. And as a member of the Labor Party in the Melbourne SECC, it was very, very disappointing to see the kind of campaign that you turned out. I was a former party official. I thought I trained a lot of people in how to run good campaigns. Clearly, my training wasn't effective because the shit that was put out by the Labor campaign was poor. Look, if it was just like we're just going to try and get David Griffiths up, then that's fine. But to say that you wanted to win the mayoralty and then turn that out is disappointing. Who else? Paul Guerrera, who's the head of Becky, who wandered into this as a partial partisan in supporting Aaron Wood and lost. To quote Marcellus Wallace from Pulp Fiction, "You've lost your Melbourne privileges. You leave town tonight and you stay gone. Be gone and you stay gone." Just so biased in there. They did some bullshit thing on behalf of their members, and I don't think half their members agreed, where they did like sort of, rating all the different tickets and rated ours badly and rated Aaron Woods excellently. Well, you backed the wrong horse, Paul, and you're going to suffer for it. Anyway, there are my reflections. Final reflections, obviously, to our campaign team. Well done. I loved getting the Andrews campaign team back together again. And even though we were cut out of the preference deals and we're sort of thinking, we're stuffed, I did say to the team, hey, we've got a strategy. Let's stick to it. Don't lose focus. All we need to do is put Nick in a position to win and see what happens in the count. And we knocked on more doors than anyone else. We engaged with more stakeholders than anyone else. We got more paid media content out than anyone else. We had more earned media than anyone else. We actually sent more mail than anyone else, which is something that, David, I don't rate mail, but we still did it. And guess what? We got more votes.
You won, by the way.
Yeah, we got more votes than anyone else, and we won, and that's what happened. So well done to Nick Rees and the team. A lovely, lovely victory. David, do you have anything to say about local government elections?
I feel like you really did advertise yourself there as a mean, vindictive and gloating person. Mm-hmm. Congratulations to Nick Rees. I'm thrilled he won. I think we're all a bit annoyed with Phil Reid and his band of merry men, and they got utterly smashed. They ended up being nothing more than a preference feeder for the Greens, and they got smashed too. And they didn't succeed in getting a Labor person elected to the council. So they didn't even fail in their alleged priority, let alone their actual priority of trying to get Phil elected. So they were a total waste of space, and that's a humiliation for them. Hopefully, lesson learned is that they should collaborate with other Labor tickets. Great result. But I feel like you've missed what is probably the most important happening. And that is the results here in the city of Darebin. Because if we're going to talk about council elections, what we saw in the city of Darebin, I'm proud to say, was the defeat of the Greens and the election of Labor here in my local government area, which is not one we've won for a long time. There is now a majority of 5 Labor councillors, and it was a very significant victory because it involved turning over some long-serving Labor councillors with some new blood, as well as electing Labor councillors in wards previously held by the Greens. So it was an ambitious campaign, but it succeeded. And I'm, as one of the humble burghers of Northcote, absolutely bloody thrilled.
Any name checks you want to call out in terms of those who got elected from the Labor ticket?
Emily, no, but
no. But well done to all anyway. Good stuff.
Well done to all.
Fantastic. Well, this has been a monster episode, David. We've covered a lot. We've covered all 4 levels of government today. So
yes, we have. It's good. We've included our American masters in our levels of government, so that's good.
Yep. And thank you so much for today's episode. To our listeners, this is November, so we've got one more episode of with David before we wrap for the year. It'll be a very Feeney Christmas type of episode, I feel. Might do a summary of the whole year.
Well, I mean, we could get some Darebin councillors on. The new mayor, Christina Laris, for instance.
Yeah, the internet.
We could get some people on. Yeah.
The internet was your friend there. Very good. I saw what you did.
Actually, I was checking my email, smart ass.
But anyway, we'll be back next week. So next week is December. It's the last month of the year, if you weren't aware. And if those who listen to the show regularly will know, it's sort of when we do the wrap of all the different things, an international wrap, federal wrap. God, I hope some federal MPs want to come on the show after we've just ripped into their government.
Yeah,
we'll see.
Don't hang your head on that one.
Yeah, no, we'll see. And a whole bunch of other sort of summaries of the. So I always look forward to the December episodes. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week. And all the other things. Thanks, David.
Cheers, mate. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.